Another nefarious consequence of the energy leveling of the radiation within the cone of light of the future of the Sun would be the circular and uniform movement. That is, the sided cone, when structured on circular waves, would have to be straight. To visualize better, imagine that the cone mentioned would result from the rotation of a right triangle over one of its sides. If the planet's orbits were to be circular, there would be no aphelion or perihelion. Worse, the Sun would always retain the same mass and brightness over time, which would prevent the observer from registering possible variations in the density of the solar mass or its volume. This led us to conclude that the Sun would have the same standardized behavior as a lighthouse or an incandescent lamp, whose brightness would decrease in proportion to the increase in the distances in which the planets are placed. If a star decreased or increased its density, it would emit more or less light into space, respectively, which would break with this standardized behavior of our Sun, currently accepted. For example, Jupiter could be receiving more light and heat from the Sun than would normally be expected. The problem is that variations in the density of stars could not be registered directly, either upwards or downwards, due to the virtual leveling of light within their light cones of the future. The problem would not be in space, but in its messenger. We will, now, analyze what would be expected in the gravitational relationship between the Sun and its planets if there were veiled variations in the density of its mass. Increasing the density of the star would imply accentuating the curvature of the space around it and decreasing its total brightness. Although its total mass remains conserved in our normal lifespan, a higher density would make the star sink further into space. As an example, we can mention the situation of Saturn, which, due to the very low density, lower than that of the water, should float if it were placed in a pool. If you did the same with Earth, the planet would go straight to the bottom of the pool. When it comes to light, the messenger that sooner or later will communicate changes in the geometry of space, it would obey a simple harmonic movement. The elastic space model shows that its behavior would be inseparable from the light itself. The first phase of the harmonic movement of light, the stretching of the spring, would be accompanied by an increase in the elastic potential energy. When this potential energy was maximum, the kinetic energy would be zero, as both complement each other. There would be no measurable movement at this stage. If we applied this model to the solar system, the maximum stretching of space would, therefore, establish the immobility of the planet at the point of maximum approach in relation to the Sun. If the Sun could manifest its point of view, it would tell us that it has always been pushing the planet away from itself, but the planet would insist on pushing in the opposite direction, getting closer. This point of maximum approximation, perihelion, could not be exceeded, which would prevent the collision between both. When the spring or space relaxes, it could be related to an increase in the volume of the star, or a decrease in the density of its mass, resulting in a decrease in potential energy. The star would need to use less force to drive the planet away. This could be interpreted as if the spring is contracting or entering the second phase of harmonic movement. However, as the spring still stands in its first phase of stretching, it would only stretch less, inducing a drop in potential energy. This would relieve pressure on the center of the solar system. It is seen that gravity, normally associated with a phase of contraction of space, in this case would become a secondary or restoration force. Thus, space would always be stretching, more or less, generating an apparent emptiness or a predisposition in space to bring planets together or to move them apart. The gravity should be more accentuated in the phase of maximum spring extension and maximum approximation of the planet in relation to the Sun. From there, and following the decrease in potential energy, the planet would start its distancing in the direction of the aphelion. The potential elastic energy, finally, would tend to become minimal in the aphelion and null in the infinite. Gravity is the only known force that would be able to act on the scale of planets and galaxies and, according to Newton, would do it instantly and at a distance. It would increase in the direct ratio of the masses and in the inverse of the square of the distances. That is, gravity decreases with increasing distances. When it comes to the analogy between the behavior of space and that of an elastic band widely used by astronomers, the spring of space would already appear in space-time in its resting phase. That is, the spring would be neither stretched nor contracted. The potential energy would be zero at infinity and would tend to decline as decrease the distance between two bodies which attract each other. In space-time, the potential energy would always be negative, and the spring would always be in its contraction phase. This does not allow predicting, in space-time, the existence of a stretching phase for the space spring, corresponding to the first phase of harmonic movement, if it were described by light, or had its behavior compared to that of an elastic strip. So, something is missing from this model. In the case of the Earth, and according to the currently accepted model, when the planet approaches the Sun, the spring of space should be contracting. In other words, the spring would have been at rest in the aphelion, and, from there, it would start accelerating towards the perihelion, following the contraction of the spring. In the alternative interpretation presented in this work, which considers gravity as a force of a secondary or restorative nature, the planet would accelerate as a secondary response to the spring stretching movement. This phase would have created an emptiness in space to be filled with delay by the planet. This would justify the Einstein's attempt to explain Newton's absolute space, according to which space would be able to generate inertia independently of the masses. According to Einstein's words, Newton's space acts on the masses, nothing acts on it. It would be quite plausible to say that the spring stretching phase could correspond to that of quantization or packaging of the light. That light and the information it carries would be retained in this phase, justifying the void in space. The void would be associated with a complementary contraction of time. Without time, there is no measurable movement. It is known that the packaging process does not require time, and that our memory, by definition, does not work without time. Therefore, if there was something in space before the manifestation of the second phase of the harmonic movement of light, scattering, it would cease to exist, because it cannot be remembered. Thus, the quantization phase, by retaining the light, could simulate a curvature in space. This would suggest that there would have been a contraction of the solar mass, making it more dense and generating a predisposition in space for the attraction of the planets. It is as if the planets are constantly being pushed against the Sun, compressing it. On the contrary, a smaller stretch would relax this mass and decrease the tension on the center of the system, making the star less dense and with greater volume. The star would shine more than normal. On the other hand, decompression of space would push the planets away from the Sun. This could extend to 5 billion years from now, when the Sun passes through its red giant stage. it is seen that, contrary to prediction, the planets would gradually move away from the star and are no longer swallowed by it. When it comes to the potential elastic energy, it would have the function of establishing extreme limits for the approach or removal of the planets in relation to the Sun. It would be impossible to clash between the planets and the star, and, likewise, it would be impossible for them to deviate or get lost in the void of space. Thus, it is justified the thought that the Sun would have captured the planets, each one in a particular way, obeying the variations in solar density and its variable influence on the curvature of space. There is also that problem of placing the observer on the fixed end of the mass spring assembly and not the Sun. This is due to the fact that the Sun would not be able to express its point of view, which would shift the 0 point of time to the position of whoever could do it. Everything in the universe can be on the center, but only those who have a memory could know that. The center of the universe would be where an observer with a memory was, whether here, on Earth, or in the most distant galaxy. If space stretched from the Earth, in this first phase of the harmonic movement of light, the force would point in the opposite direction, or towards the position of the observer. The Earth would pull the Sun towards it. This does not happen in practice, because, at this stage, the work done by the light would be intrinsic, or negative. It is said that it would be virtually contained within the observer himself. This would also happen with a total time of displacement of light, which would have been retained within the cone of light of the future of the Sun, and which could only be evaluated indirectly, or with delay. It can be seen that we would be talking, all the time, about the information we use as a basis for the formation of our points of view. The space, in turn, would be out of the process. The universe is still around, and it doesn't seem to be too concerned with all of that.